I never imagined that the end of 35 years of absolute dedication would come through a cold, blue light triggered by a notification on my phone while I tried to swallow bitter coffee in the solitude of my kitchen. There was a photo of the facade of our house, the one I helped plan every detail of, posted in one of those Phoenix sales and business groups, accompanied by a caption that took my breath away and made the world spin. For sale. Mansion in Paradise Valley, turnkey, and the old nagging wife comes as a bonus for anyone with patience. My husband, the man for whom I abandoned a promising career in administration to become the invisible foundation of his days, had just turned me into a used piece of furniture, disposable clutter before thousands of strangers. It only took one single no, the first I dared to utter in decades of silence, for him to decide to destroy me publicly, using his phone as a weapon to ridicule my exhaustion and my 57 years of life. I felt a shame that burned my skin, a heat rising up my neck as messages from acquaintances began to arrive, feigning concern but overflowing with curiosity about my ruin. I looked at those words on the screen and saw the mockery in Oswald's eyes. The same look he gave me the previous afternoon, when my resistance finally overflowed. For years, I was the woman who said amen to all his stubbornness, who polished the silver until my hands ached, and who organized his schedule with clockwork precision, all to receive in return the emptiness of a loving gesture. I became a domestic employee, without salary or days off, a shadow that floated through the house, ensuring his comfort was never interrupted. But the body speaks what the mouth silences, and my mind could no longer bear the weight of that grinding mechanism that wore me down a little more with each passing day, in that stifling heat of the Arizona desert. I remember when we got married. I was a young woman full of plans, with a diploma under my arm and the conviction that love would be a partnership, not a contract of servitude. Oswald was a determined man, or at least that's how I interpreted his stubbornness at the time. I thought his strength would protect me, but over time I realized that strength was only used to bend my will. Little by little, my desires were filed away. First it was my job, then my courses, until all that remained was the house, the garden, and impeccably ironed shirts. I became the guardian of a castle where I myself was a prisoner, taking care of every detail so that he could shine outside while I faded inside, between walls decorated with paintings he chose and furniture that never had my personal touch. That's why 6 months ago I started looking for help, walking along the wide sidewalks of the Uptown District to reach Dr. Beatrice's office. I entered there as one carrying a sinful secret, feeling that taking care of my mental health was a betrayal, an affront to the perfect family image Oswald insisted on maintaining. The sessions were the only moments I felt seen, where my name Clarice sounded real and not just like a call to serve the next dish. She was the one who reached out to me in that abyss of sadness, showing me that I was not an extension of his will, but a woman with rights, with weariness, and with a story that deserved to be respected. It was Dr. Beatrice who planted the seed of change, suggesting I start setting small boundaries to test our dynamic and see if there was still room for dialogue in a marriage that felt more like an authoritarian monologue. I want to thank Storytime with Dale for opening this space for me to tell my story and share with you this moment of so much pain and transformation. It's a comfort to know I'm not alone. Please like this video if my journey touches your heart in any way, and feel free to comment below where you're listening from now and what time it is in your city, so I can feel the company of each of you. The decision to say the first no was like trying to move a mountain with my bare hands. I spent sleepless nights rehearsing my voice, trying to find a tone that wasn't aggressive but firm enough to be heard. That Tuesday, the Phoenix sun seemed more aggressive than usual, and the oppressive heat seeped through the windows of Paradise Valley as if to stifle any attempt at rebellion. Oswald entered my private office, which was actually just a laundry room I had adapted, and threw an immense pile of documents onto the desk. "Clarice, organize these by date and value, and then take care of that silver coffee set. I have an important meeting tonight and I want everything to shine like new," he said, without even looking into my eyes, already turning his back to leave. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a weariness that wasn't from lack of sleep, but from my soul. My blood pressure seemed to have dropped, and a slight dizziness made me grab the edge of the ironing board. I took a deep breath, smelling the steam from the iron, and called his name with a calm I didn't even know I possessed. Oswald, I'm really not feeling well today. I feel a persistent weakness and a very strong headache. If you could take care of this organizing and the silver cleaning this time, I would immensely appreciate it. I need to lie down for a bit. The silence that followed was cutting. He stopped in the hallway, slowly turned on his heels, and stared at me with an expression of pure disbelief, as if the walls had just come to life to complain about the dust. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice low and laden with a contained aggression that always made me tremble. I repeated it, my heart pounding against my ribs, trying to maintain my dignity. He didn't yell immediately, but approached me with slow steps, closing the space until I could smell his expensive cologne and the heat of his indignation. "You're not well? You live inside this house, protected from the sun, with food on the table and everything good and best, and now you decide you're too tired to polish some silver? This is that woman you see every week, isn't it? She's filling your head with nonsense." He spoke of Dr. Beatrice with a contempt that hurt me more than a physical blow. He continued the humiliation, listing everything he supposedly gave me, ignoring the decades of unpaid labor and emotional support I provided him. The discussion didn't escalate to physical aggression, but his words were like whips. He said I was ungrateful, that I was useless if I couldn't keep the house in order, and that if I wanted so much to be treated as independent, I should start paying my own bills. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard that the painting on the hallway wall tilted. I sat on the floor of that small room and cried, a silent cry from someone who realizes their love was invested in barren ground. But his cruelty hadn't reached its limit yet. He went to his office, locked the door, and in less than an hour the ad was online. He wanted to punish me in the most public and degrading way possible, using our intimacy as currency for his wounded ego. News of the ad spread like wildfire. Phoenix is a big city, but our social circle in Paradise Valley functions like a small village where everyone watches everyone else. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating. There were notifications from WhatsApp groups, messages from old neighbors, and even from distant cousins I hadn't seen in years. "Clarice, did you see what Oswald posted?" "Friend, is this serious or a bad joke? Oh my God, how embarrassing. How could he do this?" Each message was like a nail in a coffin. I felt exposed in a public square, stripped of all respect. He put me up for sale along with the furniture, calling me old and nagging, as if I were a burden he needed to unload to the first buyer who appeared. I spent the rest of that afternoon in a state of emotional numbness. I looked at my arms, at the skin that was starting to show the signs of time, and wondered at what point I stopped being Clarice to become the unwanted bonus of a real estate transaction. The humiliation was so dense I could feel it in the air of the house, mixed with the smell of metal polish I hadn't had the strength to use. Oswald walked around the living room with his phone in hand, laughing loudly at the reactions the ad caused. He felt powerful, the master of reason, who had just put his disobedient wife in her rightful place. He commented aloud about the supposed interested parties, saying that the house was worth a lot, but the bonus would certainly make the price drop. Night fell over Paradise Valley, and the city lights began to shine outside, but inside me was pure darkness. I refused to leave the guest room. For the first time in 35 years, I didn't prepare his dinner, didn't set the table, and didn't wait for him to finish eating to clean everything up. I was on strike, not just from work, but from affection. I heard his noises in the kitchen, opening the refrigerator, grumbling because he didn't find what he wanted. The feeling of freedom, though mixed with a paralyzing fear, began to grow within me. I wasn't a house, I wasn't a turnkey property, and I certainly wasn't anyone's bonus. The next morning, the silence in the house was tense, like the calm before a tropical storm. I was in the kitchen trying to maintain my minimal survival routine when Oswald's phone began to ring incessantly. He answered with that businessman's voice he always used to impress strangers. "Yes. The house is available turnkey as per the ad. The price is what's listed, but we can discuss it if payment is cash. And yes, The ad's promise stands, though it's just a figure of speech, a joke. You understand, don't you? He chuckled, that dry laugh I had learned to despise. He hung up the phone and entered the kitchen, looking me up and down with renewed contempt. Get ready, Clarice. A genuinely interested buyer is coming here in 3 hours. He offered above market value to take everything. Sounds like an investor who's returned from overseas. Wash your face and put on some decent clothes. I don't want him to think the bonus is as spoiled as it looks. His words were like poison dripping into my ears. He left the kitchen without waiting for a reply, leaving behind the trail of his arrogance. I stood there looking at my trembling hands, feeling that fate was knocking on my door in a way I couldn't foresee. 3 hours. That was the time I had to compose myself, to find within me a shred of courage that would allow me to face that visit without collapsing. Phoenix outside continued its indifferent routine, the heat rising from the asphalt and cars speeding by, while I felt suspended in time. I didn't know who that buyer was. I didn't know what he expected to find, but I knew I wouldn't be the old, nagging wife Oswald advertised. I walked to the bathroom, washed my face with cold water, and looked in the mirror. I saw a 57-year-old woman with expression lines that told the story of a lifetime of renunciation. But I also saw deep in my pupils a spark of resistance that hadn't yet been extinguished. As I chose a simple, yet elegant dress, a style I liked but rarely wore because he said it made me too flashy, I felt a flutter in my stomach that I hadn't felt since my youth. It was as if the gears of an old clock were working again after decades of rust. I wasn't getting dressed for the buyer, nor for Oswald. I was getting dressed for myself, for the woman who still inhabited that body and who refused to be sold along with the bricks and mortar. I heard the sound of the electronic gate opening. The engine's hum echoed through the garden and my heart skipped a beat. Oswald rushed to the entrance hall, adjusting his posture, ready to close the deal of his life and complete my final humiliation. I remained at the top of the stairs, my hand gripping the wooden railing so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The car that entered the driveway was dark, imposing, and silent. When the door opened and the man stepped out, I still couldn't see his face clearly because of the sun's reflection on the glass, but his presence seemed to fill the entire patio space. In that instant, I felt the air of Phoenix suddenly change, as if a fresh breeze had come from far away to clear the dust from that house. Something was about to change, something that went far beyond contracts and deeds. I descended the steps of that solid wood staircase, feeling as if each step weighed a ton. My right hand squeezed the railing so hard I could feel the grooves of the wood etched into my palm. I felt like a condemned woman walking to her own executioner, but there was a flicker of defiance, a spark of stubbornness that kept me from bowing my head. When I reached the last step, Oswald was already flinging open the double front door with that wide, fake smile he reserved for important clients. A smile that never, in 35 years, had been directed at me freely. The strong Phoenix sun invaded the hall, drawing a dazzling rectangle on the granite floor. And in the center of that light, the silhouette of the man who had just arrived seemed cut out against the blue sky of the desert. "Welcome. It's a pleasure to receive a man of vision like yourself," Oswald said, extending his hand with an effusiveness that bordered on flattery. I remained there, in the shadows of the hallway, watching the visitor cross the threshold of our home. He wore an impeccably tailored suit in a charcoal gray that contrasted with the brightness outside. When he took the first step inside and his eyes adjusted to the dimness of the room, time simply stopped. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the entire room, leaving only a vacuum where only the sound of my disordered heartbeats echoed in my ears. That face, those eyes that held the color of strong coffee and an intensity I thought I had buried in 1985. It was Henry, the same Henry my father had thrown out of our living room almost 40 years ago, calling him an adventurer and saying that a young man without a traditional surname and without a solid career would never be worthy of entering our family. Henry, the young man who used to wait for me at the college door with flowers picked along the way and who promised that one day he would take me to see the world. He stood there in front of me, transformed into a man whose presence emanated a silent power and an elegance that Oswald, with all his bank account and arrogance, could never buy. Oswald, in his egocentric blindness, didn't notice the shock that paralyzed us. He kept talking, presenting the house as if he were selling any old warehouse. "This is the main living room. As you can see, the finish is top-notch. And back there is Clarice, my wife. You must have seen the ad, right? She comes with the furniture. She's a bit worn down by the years, like the furniture, but she still comes in handy in the kitchen," he said, letting out that dry, short laugh that humiliated me more than any slap. In that moment, I wanted to scream, wanted to run to my room and lock myself in, but Henry's eyes held me captive. He didn't laugh. He didn't look away with embarrassment. He looked directly at me, and deep in his pupils, I saw an ancient pain mix with profound indignation. Henry ignored Oswald's extended hand to point at a painting on the wall and, with a voice that sounded like balm in those cold walls, said, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Clarice. I must say, the good taste of this house is evident, and something tells me the most important details were not decided by your husband." Oswald cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable at having his joke ignored, and tried to regain control of the situation. "Ah, you know how it is. Women like to choose curtains and rugs, but I'm the one who pays the bills and ensures the structure. Come, let me show you the rest of the property. You'll be impressed with the garden." Even though Clarice has this habit of planting trees that only make a mess, we began a torturous walk through the rooms of the mansion. Oswald went ahead, boasting about the value of each square foot, the brand of the central air conditioning, and the security of the gated community in Paradise Valley. Henry followed him in silence, but I noticed he wasn't looking at the electrical outlets or the drywall ceiling. He was looking at the photo frames, at the books on the shelf I loved so much and Oswald detested, at the small ceramics I had molded myself in a class I was forced to abandon because my husband said it was a waste of time. Each time our eyes met, a flashback hit me with the force of a current. I remembered the afternoons we spent at Encanto Park, sitting on the grass, planning a life that seemed so simple and so brilliant. I remembered the day he told me he would have to leave for Europe, that he had gotten a scholarship, but that he would come back for me. I promised to wait, but my family's pressure, the letters my father intercepted and destroyed, and the constant brainwashing that I needed a man with a future, like the young and ambitious Oswald, eventually broke me. I married the security my father desired and, in exchange, surrendered my soul to be molded by a man who saw marriage as a business transaction. Henry left with a broken heart, and I stayed, becoming the perfect wife, the impeccable homemaker, the shadow of a stubborn man. Now he was back. Henry had become a widower 3 years ago, as he subtly mentioned while we walked to the outdoor area, saying he had spent decades in Portugal and Switzerland. He spoke of his wife's loss with a tenderness that made me feel a pang of envy. He spoke of a companion, a woman who was loved and respected until her last breath. The contrast with how Oswald referred to me was stark. It was an open wound that Henry seemed to want to stop just with his presence. We reached the garden. The Phoenix sun was at its peak, and the smell of wet earth and jasmine flowers filled the air. I dedicated years to that garden, tending to each seedling, talking to the plants in my moments of greatest solitude. Oswald hated greenery. He wanted to pave everything to build a sports court he would never use, just to show off to the neighbors. "Look at this space," Oswald said, pointing to the lawn. "You can tear all this out and make a real gourmet area. This mess of leaves Clarice cultivates only serves to attract bugs." Henry stopped before an ancient mesquite tree that I had fought to save from being cut down when we built the pool. He ran his hand over the tree's rough trunk and said without looking at Oswald, "A man who doesn't value the roots of his own home will hardly value what's inside it. This garden is a work of art, Mr. Oswald. It's what gives soul to this place. I wouldn't change a single leaf." I felt a lump in my throat. It was the first time in decades someone had defended something I loved, validated my existence and my effort in that house. Oswald gave a nervous chuckle, clearly not understanding the depth of that criticism. "You're an enthusiast, I see. But let's talk business. You saw the ad, saw the price, 40% above market value, but I'm delivering it with everything inside. Absolutely everything. Henry slowly turned and for the first time confronted Oswald directly. You stated in the ad that your wife is part of the deal. I thought it was an unfortunate metaphor, a lapse in judgment, or a questionable attempt at humor, but I see you're serious. Do you really see Mrs. Clarice as a chattel? Oswald puffed out his chest, thinking he was being clever. Oh, it's just a joke among friends. You know how the business world is. She's been here for 35 years, knows every corner, knows how I like things. It's a way of saying that whoever buys won't have any trouble with anything. But if you don't want the bonus, I'll find a way to send her to her sister's house in the countryside. I closed my eyes for a second, feeling a dizziness that forced me to lean against one of the veranda columns. The humiliation was so public, so blatant, that the air seemed to have become unbreathable. Henry walked towards me. He didn't ask Oswald for permission. He stopped in front of me and, with a delicacy that made me want to cry right there, asked, "Are you all right, Clarice?" He used my first name, without the formal Mrs., without the formal distance Oswald imposed. He used the tone of voice he used when we were 19 and the world was ours. I nodded positively, unable to articulate a complete sentence. Oswald approached, visibly annoyed by the attention Henry was giving me. "She's fine. It's just the Phoenix heat. She gets these whims now and then, ever since she started seeing that psychologist. Let's go to the office. We can sign a letter of intent to purchase right now, if you're decided." Henry looked at me one last time before following Oswald. In that gaze, I read a promise. It wasn't the promise of a real estate buyer, it was the promise of a man who had waited a lifetime to correct a past mistake. As the two entered the office, I remained. The afternoon silence was interrupted only by the song of a mockingbird at the top of the mesquite tree. I looked at my hands and realized they were no longer trembling. Henry's presence had brought a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. I wasn't a bonus, I wasn't part of a turnkey deal. I was Clarice Miller, the woman who once loved and was loved, and who now realized that the key to that prison was and always had been in my own hands. I heard muffled voices coming from the office. Oswald was ecstatic, laughing, probably already making plans for the money he would receive. He thought he was selling a house and getting rid of an old wife. He didn't realize that Henry wasn't there to buy bricks and cement. Henry was there for me. He had seen the cruel ad on a social network and recognized the house, recognized my name, and knew, in that very instant, that his decades-long search had finally come to an end. He had crossed the state, perhaps the country, to be there at that exact moment. I approached the office window, which was ajar because of the heat. I could hear Henry say, "The price is fair, Mr. Oswald. I accept your proposal, but I want it stated in the contract that the sale is truly turnkey, including all inherent rights to the property and what you advertised. I don't want anything, absolutely anything, to leave this house without my consent." Oswald let out a triumphant laugh. "Deal. You don't know the weight you're lifting from my shoulders. Let's get to the documents." I stepped away from the window, feeling a chill. Henry was playing Oswald's game, using my husband's greed against him. I didn't fully understand the legal details, but I knew Henry was too intelligent a man to accept such a clause without a greater purpose. Was he buying me, or was he ensuring I had a place to stay when the divorce inevitably happened? My heart pounded with a mixture of fear and hope that I hadn't felt since I was a girl. I returned to the kitchen and started preparing coffee, not out of obligation, but to have something to anchor me to reality. The scent of fresh grounds rose, filling the room. I looked at the kitchen, at every cabinet I had organized, at every tile I had meticulously cleaned over decades. I loved that house, despite everything. It had been my refuge and my cell. And now it was being sold by a man who hated me, to a man who loved me. The office door opened, and the two men emerged. Oswald was radiant, his eyes shining. "Clarice, prepare something special. Mr. Henry is closing the deal. He's taking everything." Henry walked to the kitchen table and accepted the cup of coffee I offered. His fingers brushed mine for a brief second as he took the cup, and that electrical spark traveled up my arm, making the hairs on my neck tingle. "Thank you, Clarice. Your coffee is exactly as I imagined it would be," he said with an enigmatic smile that made my legs weak. Oswald didn't notice the tension, didn't notice the exchange of glances, didn't notice anything. He was too busy counting imaginary money in his head. "Well, Mr. Henry, I have some commitments now. You know how the life of a producer is. Clarice can finish showing you the wiring and plumbing details. She knows every nook and cranny of this house." Henry nodded. "Perfect. I would very much like to talk more with Mrs. Clarice about the workings of this house. I'm sure she has a lot to teach me." As soon as Oswald left, slamming the gate with his usual haste and disregard, the silence that settled between us was loaded with 25 years of unasked questions. Henry placed the cup on the table, looked around to ensure we were alone, and took a step towards me. The distance between us was now only a few inches. I could feel the warmth of his body and the intensity of his woody cologne. "Clarice," he whispered, and my name in his voice sounded like a prayer. I saw the ad. I couldn't believe what he wrote. I came as fast as I could. The tears I had held back throughout the visit finally began to overflow. "Why, Henry? Why after all this time?" He held my face with both hands, his thumbs wiping the moisture from my skin with a tenderness that completely disarmed me. "Because I never stopped looking for you, and because I wasn't going to let that man treat the woman I always loved as if she were a leftover piece of furniture." In that moment, I knew that my life in Phoenix, the life I knew, had come to an end, and that perhaps the real deal that afternoon wasn't the sale of a house, but the recovery of a dignity I swore I had lost forever. Past and present merged in a single instant of revelation, and I realized that the buyer who had knocked on my door hadn't come to possess me, but to give me back to myself. Night began to show its first signs on the Arizona horizon, tinging the sky with shades of orange and purple, and I felt that, for the first time in 35 years, I wasn't afraid of the darkness to come. Something very important was still to come, and I knew I was no longer alone to face the storm that divorce would bring. Henry still held my face with a delicacy I had forgotten existed between two people. His touch wasn't one of possession like Oswald's, but of profound recognition, as if he were rereading a precious book that had been snatched from his hands long ago. I cried, but it wasn't that dry, desperate cry of humiliation. It was a cry of catharsis, a cleansing that began to wash away the decades of dust that had accumulated on my soul. We stayed there in the silence of that kitchen, which had witnessed so many solitary dinners and so many harsh words, while the wall clock ticked the seconds of a freedom I was beginning to taste. He led me to a wooden chair at the counter and sat in front of me without letting go of my hand. "Clarice, I didn't come here just to buy a house." When I saw that absurd ad, my blood boiled, but my mind cleared at the same instant. I knew it was you. I recognized the address. I recognized your name. And, above all, I recognized the cruelty of a man who never deserved the air you breathe. He said with a voice filled with a firmness that brought me absolute security. Henry told me that after all those years in Europe, he had returned to the States with the intention of investing in properties in Phoenix, but that the true reason for his return was a silent search for me. He never knew exactly what fate had reserved for our interrupted love, but he knew he couldn't die without seeing my face one last time. I opened my heart to him. I told him about the exhaustion, about the therapy sessions with Dr. Beatrice, and about how my first no resulted in that public and inhuman revenge. I spoke of how I felt like a piece of furniture, a cog that only received attention when it stopped working. Henry listened to every word with an attention that made me feel important, something I hadn't experienced since I was a young student full of plans. He told me that Oswald's turnkey ad was my husband's fatal mistake, because in trying to dehumanize me, he opened a legal and emotional loophole that Henry intended to use in my favor. "That man thinks he's making the deal of the century, Clarice. He thinks he's going to receive a fortune and get rid of what he calls a burden. But what he doesn't know is that I accepted his terms exactly as he wrote them. If he wants to sell the house with everything in it, including you, then I will be the legal owner of everything. And the first thing I'll do as the owner of this house is to ensure you are never treated with disrespect again," he explained. and for a moment, I didn't understand how that would work in practice. He then revealed that he had a powerful legal team and that the letter of intent to purchase Oswald signed contained clauses that would protect my continued stay in the house and my share in the divorce. Something my husband's blind greed prevented him from carefully analyzing. The conversation flowed for almost an hour, a time that felt like a breath against 35 years of absence. Henry spoke to me of his late wife, a Portuguese woman he loved and respected, but who always knew that a part of his heart belonged to an American woman with sad eyes he had left behind in the Central Plains. He was a widower, childless, and now saw in my pain the chance to redeem our past. I felt a strange peace, a serenity that contrasted with the storm that would still come when Oswald discovered that his house of cards was about to collapse. The afternoon heat in Phoenix remained intense, but the breeze coming through the kitchen window now seemed to carry a scent of hope. Henry looked around at the tiles I had cleaned with such care, at the copper pots hanging that I polished weekly. "You've taken too good care of this place, Clarice. You gave life to these walls, and that's why they're still standing. A man like Oswald only knows how to destroy. But you are a home builder, and that's why he's losing everything while you're just starting to gain," he affirmed. And those words sounded like the life lesson I needed to hear, to stop feeling guilty for wanting to be free. We heard the sound of Oswald's car returning. The engine's roar climbing the driveway was like an alarm that the play had to continue. Henry stood up, regaining the posture of a serious and distant businessman, but before leaving the kitchen, he winked at me and whispered that I should trust him, that the end of that day would be the beginning of my new story. I quickly wiped away my tears, washed my face once more, and tried to adopt that neutral, invisible expression I had used as a mask for so many decades. Oswald entered through the living room door with an almost childish euphoria. He carried a bottle of expensive whiskey and 2 crystal glasses, completely ignoring my presence as he addressed Henry. "And so, my dear fellow, have you finished checking the wiring details with the wife? I hope she hasn't filled your ears with housewife complaints," he said, laughing and serving the drink. Henry accepted the glass with a cold courtesy. "Mrs. Clarice was extremely enlightening, Mr. Oswald. Indeed, she knows every detail of this property. I would say she is the soul of this deal, though you don't seem to have realized it yet." Henry's irony went unnoticed by Oswald, who was too busy savoring the success of his sale. They returned to the office to finalize the letter of intent to purchase, where Henry would make a down payment of $500,000, an amount that would make any greedy man lose his mind. I stayed in the living room, seated in one of the armchairs I now knew would be mine by right, listening to the sound of Oswald's pen scratching the paper. I felt that each of his signatures was a nail he himself hammered into his own arrogance. While they were locked in the office, I walked to the garden, looked at the mesquite tree, at the citrus trees, and at the flowers I had planted with so much love. I no longer felt that place was a prison. For the first time, I saw the house as my patrimony, as the result of 40 years of work that my husband tried to steal from me by treating me as a worthless bonus. The anger I felt towards Oswald was transforming into a cold determination. I was going to file for divorce. I was going to fight for every cent of my half of that house, and I was going to use the very trap he created to drive him out of my life. Henry emerged from the office a short time later, accompanied by an Oswald who seemed to float with joy. "Deal closed, Clarice. Mr. Henry is a man of his word. I received the down payment, and the rest will be paid at the closing of the deed in 30 days. And best of all, he doesn't mind your presence here until then. You can continue doing your housework until moving day," Oswald said, with a cruelty that no longer affected me. Henry merely nodded, bidding farewell with a formal handshake to Oswald and a respectful nod to me. "Until next time, Mrs. Clarice. I'm sure we'll have an excellent property transition." When Henry left, the house plunged into a strange silence. Oswald continued drinking, boasting about how he was a business genius and how that idiot had paid too much for an old house and a nagging wife. He began making plans for the money, talking about trips he would take alone, new cars, and how wonderful his life would be now that he was free from my therapy-induced whims. I listened in silence, sitting at the dinner table, feeling profound pity for that man who had everything and yet absolutely nothing. "You're not saying anything, Clarice. Mute now. You should be thanking me for finding a buyer who accepted you as a bonus," he scoffed, banging his hand on the table. I raised my eyes and, for the first time in 35 years, I didn't look away. I didn't shrug my shoulders. I simply offered a calm smile, the smile of someone who knows something the other doesn't even suspect. "I'm just thinking, Oswald, thinking about how the world turns and how some people sell what doesn't belong to them without knowing the price they'll have to pay in the end." He was confused for a moment, but alcohol and arrogance prevented him from taking my words seriously. He stood up, swaying slightly, and went up to the master bedroom, leaving the empty whiskey bottle on the dining table. I washed the glass, put the bottle in the trash, and turned off the living room lights. The Phoenix night was calm, but within me, the flame of revolution was lit. I wasn't afraid of tomorrow. I had Henry's promise. I had Dr. Beatrice's support, and, above all, I had the awareness that I was worth much more than any turnkey deal. That night I slept in the guest room, but my sleep was the deepest and most restful of my entire life. I dreamed of the sea, of the flowers of Portugal that Henry had described, and of a future where I was no one's bonus. I knew that in the next 30 days, Oswald's mask would fall, and he would discover that the buyer he had so flattered was the man who would make him sign his own defeat. The tables had turned, and I was no longer a pawn on the board. I was the player about to deliver checkmate. At dawn, the sun streamed through the blinds, illuminating the dust dancing in the air. I got up, made my coffee, and felt that each sip was a toast to my new existence. The house was still the same, the furniture was the same, but the woman who inhabited that body had been reborn. I looked at the ad on my phone, the one still online, with hundreds of malicious comments, and felt it was my trophy. It was through that humiliation that my past found me and my future opened up. Oswald came downstairs, complaining of a headache and demanding that I prepare him medicine and strong coffee. I merely pointed to the coffee maker and said with a firm and serene voice, "The coffee is ready, Oswald. The medicine is in the cabinet. From today on, you take care of your own pains. I have a whole life to organize and a lawyer to visit." The shock on his face was my first prize of the morning. He tried to scream, tried to yell that I didn't have that right, but I simply walked towards the front door, feeling the Phoenix sun warm my face. I didn't know exactly what the next legal steps would be, but I knew Henry would be by my side. The house transaction was just the beginning of a greater justice. Oswald thought he was selling his past, but he was handing over his future on a silver platter to the man I always should have loved openly. The gate was closed for him, but for me, all horizons were open. As I walked through the garden, before getting into my car to meet my new lawyer, I stopped before the mesquite tree and thanked it. I thanked it for the shade, for its patience, and for the strength its roots gave me to endure so much emotional drought. Something very important was still to come, and the final revelation would leave Oswald floored, while I finally found my place in the world. The 30 days that followed the signing of the letter of intent to purchase were the quietest and, paradoxically, the loudest of my life. On the outside, the mansion in Paradise Valley maintained its imposing facade, but on the inside, the structures of a 35-year marriage crumbled with each tick of the clock. Oswald lived in a kind of narcissistic trance, intoxicated by the idea that he would receive a fortune and finally get rid of the old wife he himself tried to auction off. He spent his days packing, choosing what to take and what to leave, always with sarcastic comments about how I should enjoy my last days of luxury before being dispatched. What he didn't know in his blind arrogance was that I wasn't just waiting for the move. I was orchestrating my freedom with the help of Dr. Adriana, the family law attorney whom Dr. Beatrice, my psychologist, had recommended. While he planned trips and new cars, I met in discreet offices, analyzing documents that proved my active participation in building that patrimony. My administration background, which he tried to bury for decades, became my greatest weapon. I pulled every statement, every contract I signed as his proxy, every piece of evidence that the consulting firm only prospered because I, behind the scenes, managed the crises his stubbornness created. Henry, for his part, maintained a professional distance necessary not to raise suspicion, but our nightly conversations by text were the oxygen that kept me alive. He assured me that everything was being prepared so that justice would be served in the most poetic way possible. The day of the final deed signing and key handover arrived with that dry and merciless Phoenix heat, a sun that seemed to want to expose all truths hidden under the rooftops. The meeting was scheduled at a traditional title company, a place with high ceilings and the smell of old paper. Oswald arrived exuding unbearable self-confidence, wearing his best suit as if he were going to receive an award. He didn't even look at me in the car. He treated me as an accessory he was about to hand over to the new owner. When we entered the conference room, Henry was already there, accompanied by his attorney. The tension in the air was almost palpable, but Henry maintained an expression of serenity that conveyed infinite peace to me. The notary public began to read the terms of the contract. Oswald interrupted every 2 paragraphs to emphasize that the sale was turnkey, including everything inside the property, laughing and looking at me with a mockery that made Henry's attorney quickly jot something down on a notepad. When it was time for the signatures, Henry's attorney intervened with a calm but cutting voice. "Before we proceed with the full transfer of funds, Mr. Oswald, we need to formalize Mrs. Clarice Miller's situation. You publicly declared and reinforced in this contract that your wife is part of the sale as an unwanted bonus. I would like to inform you that this term, in addition to constituting psychological and financial abuse, served as the basis for the contested divorce petition we have just filed." Oswald's smile vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of confusion that quickly turned to fury. "What are you talking about? What divorce, Clarice? What is this?" he vociferated, banging on the table. My attorney, who entered the room at that exact moment, placed the documents on the table with chilling elegance. "Mr. Oswald seems to have forgotten that, under the community property regime, 50% of everything you believe you own rightfully belongs to Mrs. Clarice, including this house and the sale value. By attempting to sell her as part of the furniture, you provided the necessary evidence for the court to determine not only the separation, but also compensation for emotional distress, which will be deducted from your share of the deal." Henry stood up and walked to my side, placing his hand on my shoulder in a way that made it clear once and for all whose side he was on. "Mr. Oswald, I didn't come here to buy a wife. I came to ensure that the woman you never knew how to value had the means to get rid of you. The amount I deposited as a down payment, that $500,000, has already been blocked by the court to secure Clarice's share. And as for the remaining payment, it will be made directly to the judicial account for the divorce proceedings." Oswald was pale, his mouth agape, as if the air had run out. He looked from Henry to me, trying to process that the idiot buyer was, in fact, the man who was restoring my dignity. The meeting at the title company ended with Oswald storming out, screaming threats at everyone, but being restrained by the attorneys. He discovered in the worst possible way that his arrogance had created the perfect trap for his own ruin. We returned home to Paradise Valley one last time, but not as husband and wife. Henry accompanied me as I watched Oswald be forced to pack his personal belongings into suitcases under the supervision of a court officer. He wouldn't take the silver I polished, he wouldn't take the paintings he chose without consulting me, and he certainly wouldn't take my piece. He left that mansion with only 2 suitcases and the weight of having lost everything that truly mattered because of a hate-fueled internet ad. When the electronic gate closed behind his car, the silence that settled in the garden was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. I walked to the ancient mesquite tree and rested my face against its trunk. Henry approached silently and hugged me from behind, a hug that carried the weight of almost 40 years of waiting. "It's over, Clarice. The house is yours, your life is yours," he whispered, and he was right. Through the court settlement, Henry bought Oswald's share, but instead of moving me out, he transferred the property into my name as part of a new beginning we were building. I was no longer the invisible homemaker. I was the owner of my own story. In the months that followed, the mansion in Paradise Valley underwent a transformation. We removed the heavy curtains Oswald liked, opened the windows to the Phoenix sun, and filled the rooms with the colors and art I had always loved. Henry and I rediscovered each other, not as the 19-year-olds we once were, but as two mature people who knew the value of every minute. He brought his memories from Europe, and I brought my American strength. Dr. Beatrice, my psychologist, said in our last session that my healing didn't come from money or the house, but from the moment I stopped believing I was what Oswald said I was. Today, when I look in the mirror, I don't see the old, nagging wife who was advertised turnkey. I see a 57-year-old woman who had the courage to say no and the luck of being bought by a love that time couldn't erase. Oswald kept his half of the money, but lives a bitter and solitary life, spending what remained in futile attempts to buy the company of people who don't respect him. He lost his home, lost his family, and lost the only person who truly cared for him. I, on the other hand, gained the world. The lesson life taught me, and which I make a point of sharing with those who listen, is that our value is never in the eyes of those who diminish us. Sometimes, rock bottom is just the place where we find the spring to leap towards the light. Never accept being treated as a bonus or as part of the furniture. You are the entire building. You are the foundation and the roof. And if necessary, let the whole world see your humiliation so that you may finally see your greatness. So be it. The end of my story was not the sale of a house, but the rescue of a soul that was just waiting for the right moment to shine again under the sun of my beloved Arizona. Henry now calls me to watch the sunset on the veranda. The Phoenix sky, tinged with an orange that looks like a divine painting. I smile, pick up my cup of coffee, and feel that finally the gate of my life is open to everything most beautiful. The past is a lesson, the present is a gift. And the future? Well, the future is an open road that I intend to walk hand in hand with the one who always knew I was worth much more than an internet ad. I thank every ear that opened to my truth. It's a relief to release these words and know that they might be the seed of courage for another woman who, at this very moment, may be feeling invisible. Remember, the buyer of your freedom is yourself, and the price is simply your self-love. Comment below for me, with all your affection, from which city you are hearing the conclusion of my story. And also, tell me what time it is now in your city as you listen. A kiss to the heart of each of you is greater than is greater than. What a powerful story and a gratifying outcome for Clarice. It's moving to see how Oswald's cruel plan to publicly humiliate her ended up being the stepping stone for her to reclaim her own dignity. The great lesson today is about autonomy. Clarice showed us that our value is not a bonus, and that it's never too late to reclaim the role of protagonist in our own lives. In the U.S., unfortunately, what she experienced is a silent reality called financial abuse, recognized under domestic violence laws. This happens when a partner tries to control, subtract, or humiliate a woman through her assets and rights, treating her as an object without her own will. Cases like this can and should be reported to the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE or local authorities. If you enjoyed this, consider subscribing to Storytime with Dale so you don't miss the next stories. Dear listeners who have accompanied me until the end of my story, how did you find today's tale? I'm curious about the impression it has left in your hearts and the thoughts it has sparked in you. Please feel free to share your impressions and opinions in the comments. I will carefully read each of them. The likes and subscriptions you give me are the greatest source of strength and motivation for creating better stories in the future. Please don't forget to do so. I sincerely wish that your life is always filled with happiness and good fortune, and that the warm light in your hearts never fades.